Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, and it's an enormous pleasure to be with you here this morning in your trade week, to celebrate the wonderful relationship between Los Angeles and my country, Great Britain. I think our trade's something like $7 billion a year, which is pretty impressive. To say what an amazing city Los Angeles is. When I first came to Los Angeles, I found it a little strange. I'm going to be very honest with you. But you know, someone said to me, it's going to grow on you, and it has. And it's wonderful to know that I was, in fact, I was actually the first sitting British Prime Minister to visit Los Angeles, which I did in 2006. And I celebrate the ties between Los Angeles and my country. And what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then I'm going to be interviewed by Judy. You know, my politics is pretty interesting right now back in the UK. Yours is pretty interesting. Anyway, I'm going to move swiftly on and talk a little bit about the background to the politics. So, you know, one of the advantages of leaving office is that you get to see much more of the world, and you can study it. And in my view, the single biggest characteristic of the world today is the scope, scale, and speed of change. Technology is changing our lives. Migration is changing our lives. As a result of the enormous progress through globalization over the past 20, 30 years, the politics of the world is changing. I mean, when I look at your trade with China 25 years ago and your trade with China today, I mean, it's extraordinary. So this incredible explosion of activity brings about enormous change. Changes in the way that we live, in the way that we work, in the way that we think. And globalization is essentially a force, in my view, driven not by governments but by people. But what has happened over these past years is that at the same time that in broad macro terms, globalization has brought enormous benefits. I mean, more people have been lifted out of poverty over the last 20 years than at any point in time before in human history. But globalization has also, because of the pace of its change and its impact, produced stresses that are part economic and part cultural. The economic stresses we saw in the financial crisis, whose effects are still with us, stagnating incomes for significant parts of the middle class, and job displacement, sometimes through trade, more often actually through automation and technology, and a sense that people have that the promise that my generation grew up with, and my father's generation certainly grew up with, which that each generation would do better than the last, the sense that that promise is in some way either at risk or in doubt. And then there are cultural stresses. You know, change changes the communities, it changes the environment in which people live. Things that are familiar to people are displaced by things that are less familiar. In Europe today, communities have been changed through immigration. There are worries, particularly when people come in from different cultures or different faiths, about security. The radical Islamist ideology that has gripped so much of the Middle East, as you know, has also had its impact in your country to a degree and in Europe to a very significant degree. So people see all these changes happening around them and they become anxious and worried. And then when you add to this social media, which in my view is itself a revolutionary phenomenon, because it allows movements of protest to grow at a speed and on a scale that in previous political times would have taken decades to build up. I mean, when you think you're going to have a French election in which the front runner, according to the polls, Emmanuel Macron, is somebody who literally started his political force just over a year ago and now could become the next president of France. So the result of all these changes of globalization, changes of technology, of migration, of trade, and the impact of social media has given rise to huge political movements that we call populist. But really, what that means is that they are disrupting the normal way of politics. And we've seen it here, we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it obviously in the UK with Brexit. Very briefly, I would offer these lessons, because I think we are in a new political era, but at the same time, I think we also have to be very clear about what the way forward is if we're to ensure that the progress that our countries and our societies have made is sustained. And these lessons, I think, are very briefly these. First, in my view, we have to deal with the actual anxieties that people have. In other words, it's no good us saying, we're dismissing your concerns over immigration, or when you object to cultural or economic change, you're just going to have to live with it. So the first lesson is we have to deal with the problems. If we don't deal with them, they grow and they can overwhelm existing institutions and existing political safety mechanisms within our societies. Secondly, we have to have practical policy solutions. I think one of the ironies of today's world is that certainly over our side of the Atlantic, politics has never been more partisan, and yet it's never been more obvious that the solutions are less to do with left and right and more to do with right or wrong. So we have this curious disjunction between the need to get to policy solutions for people and communities that are left behind in the era of globalization. Policy solutions which are evidence-based, may be radical, but are still realistic and sensible. And a politics which pulls people ever further to the extremes. Thirdly, we have to recognize that the one thing that would be most dangerous for the world at this stage, and we can see this most obviously here when we consider Los Angeles and your extraordinary position as the location where so much of the trade of the world comes into America. The one thing that is for sure is that protectionism is a cul-de-sac, and that the more we strengthen trading links, the more there is commercial intercourse between nations, the more likely we are to see prosperity. And one of the things that's very obvious is the difference between governing and campaigning. Politicians can make all sorts of promises when they're campaigning, but when it comes to the hard business of governing, it's important that we don't jettison the lessons that have served us well for many, many years. Fourthly, I would say the transatlantic alliance, that bulwark of our security and our stability since the Second World War between Europe and the United States of America. It's always been important, it remains important, it's going to be important for the future. In an uncertain world, particularly when these new powers are arising, and when the value system of the 21st century is going to be a contested value system, because we've got these new powers that are emerging, and no longer will the Western world hold prominence over the rest of the world. It will be a multipolar world, the 21st century. So which values govern it are important, and the values of that transatlantic alliance, values of freedom and democracy and the rule of law and the equality of people before the law, are important values to uphold. And finally, I would say that, to my mind today, a bigger political distinction than some of those that have given rise to the political parties as they exist today, here and in Europe. Political distinctions born of the Industrial Revolution and of left-wing and right-wing ideology. I would say that those distinctions, in my view, though they still arouse great passion, have less relevance today than the distinction between open and closed. Do you look at globalization as an opportunity whose risks have to be mitigated? Or do you look at globalization as a threat in the face of which you should shut down as far as possible? And you can see that in relation to trade, in relation to foreign policy, and of course in relation to migration. And I want to finish with this point, which is that throughout the 10 years that I was Prime Minister and the 10 years since, despite all the changes and all the pressures and all the difficulties in the world, I actually remain at heart optimistic about our future. And when you see a city like Los Angeles, or the city from which I came a short time ago, London, you see how these cities have become great by welcoming in people of different race and nation and ethnicity and color, and by creating cities and communities that are open-minded towards the world. We have built great things. And despite all those challenges, I remain optimistic that that open-minded view of the world will prevail, and that the spirit and the values that gave rise to the success that is Los Angeles today will be the spirit and values not just of your country, but of the world as it matures in this 21st century. It's an extraordinary thing to remain optimistic after all this time in politics. But actually I am, and when I come here, I know why. Thank you very much indeed.